Last week we talked about how European contact with indigenous groups in what is today Minnesota in some ways was built on mutual benefit. The trade relied on both partners, obviously, getting something out of it. And in many ways it improved the lives of the indigenous people, but in many ways it also actively destroyed the culture that they had prior to European settlement and European contact. And where we left it was essentially the arming of the indigenous people and how the added pressure and the new pressure of European trade and European politics led to new conflicts for the indigenous people of Minnesota. I am Sam Temple, and we are talking about Minnesota history. This is based off of North Country, and joining me is Logan Ledman.
That's right, Sam. Yeah, we're taking a look at Mary Wingerd's really fantastic book in this second part of our series. Today we're going to follow Chapter 2, Cultural Crossroads, in, like you said, North Country. This chapter is essentially the last decades, the last century or so of French rule of what is now Minnesota.
New France.
New France, as it was called, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
The good old days.
Yeah. So before we get into some of the war and the conflict that was building up last week, let's do a bit of a refresher on indigenous culture.
Yeah, and specifically I want to talk about, starting on page 40 in her chapter, Wingerd describes this complicated hybrid society that's forming in Minnesota by 1700 or so. You'll remember from last time the coureurs des bois, the unlicensed fur traders, operating without a license from the French crown, who form an important part of the fur trade in Minnesota. And they intermarry with the Dakota and Ojibwe people. They form new kinds of social bonds and interact in exciting new ways with the people around them. And it forms this society that is neither entirely French nor entirely Dakota or Ojibwe.
Yeah, and oftentimes this dynamic is simplified, and you and I are guilty of this in our tellings too, Logan, simplified into there's the European group coming in and there's the Dakota or Ojibwe group, depending on what history you're telling. Yeah. There's the indigenous group and there's the white group. And like most things, it is a lot more complicated than that. Obviously, there's there have been a lot of different words to describe mixed blood people, essentially, and that is one of them. The navigation of being responsible for both cultural demands of, for example, we've talked a lot about Alexander Faribault. He had French culture and Dakota culture, and he had to navigate his responsibilities and obligations in both of those worlds. And for some, it could feel like you just belonged in multiple worlds, or you never fully belonged in either world. Later in the book, we're also going to talk about Joseph Rolette, who had a similar navigation. So we'll bring up individuals like that as they come up throughout the story. But it's important in this oversimplification to not lose countless individuals who lived that very complicated life, and who can get lost when it's simplified to here are the Europeans, here are the indigenous people. That's where the conflict is. And one thing we'll talk about in this chapter is a lot of, it's easy to break history down into the wars and the conflicts, and everything's either building up or cooling off from one war or another. Minnesota is unique in that a lot of it was based around trade. It was based around essentially diplomatic and trade relationships rather than siege.
That's right. One thing I want to point out while we're talking about this culture and the intermixing, on page 42, Wingerd talks about an example of one of those clashes, or a lack of understanding. There's this sense among the French that native peoples were lazy, and as she writes, what the French deemed laziness in actuality stemmed from a non-materialist value system that was incomprehensible to Europeans. The French, she writes, and the British and Americans who followed them tried their best to enmesh the Indians in an acquisitive culture of consumption, which would then impel them to put all their energies into hunting for the trade. However, to the continuing frustration of the Europeans, the Indians refused to embrace the profit-making ethos that was central to the European mindset. End quote. So there's a lot going on. There's the European societies coming in with their own sets of values. There's the native societies that have their sets of values sharpened over centuries, and there's going to be some conflict between there's going to be some misunderstandings between those two groups. But there's also, like Sam said, critically, a third kind of society that's forming, which is the one that is both a mix of and not either French or Indian.
And how does that how does that third group come about? I hear you asking, dear listener. I'm also going to quote from page 42 here. Wingerd writes that among both the Algonquian and Siouan people, as well as most other Indian groups, women had nearly as much freedom in choosing their marital partners as did men. Parents typically arranged the match, but daughters usually were free to refuse a proposed bridegroom. The marriage bond remained The marriage bond remained intact only as long as both parties were contented with the arrangement, and either husband or wife could choose to divorce without stigma. Thus, according to native custom, it did not necessarily constitute abandonment when traders moved on to a new territory or returned east and left their Indian wives behind. Since married couples generally remained in the village of the wife's family, it would not be surprising for women to choose to remain with their kin and marry again. Polygamy, though not the norm, was also an accepted practice. Recurring warfare left most villages with a shortage of young men, and polygamy provided a practical means for the community to absorb an excess of females into a limited number of households. Therefore, as perceived by Indian people, it was not out of bounds for traders to have more than one wife simultaneously. End quote. Of course, what we have seen and we talked about last time is because so much of indigenous trade is built on kinship relationships, generally the best traders were the best husbands, or perhaps the other way around. The better you were with your new family, essentially, the better your business and your way of living in this North Country was going to be. So,
and that's that's what I was just to say. That's what there's a self-reinforcing process that made connections between French and Dakota and Ojibwe peoples in Minnesota. It was that exact process that you just described that helped bring these societies together in a really highly mutualistic and cooperative way. And central to that, I want to highlight on page 43 Wingerd's discussion of the place of women in the fur trade. She describes wives as critical economic partners. They cooked, sewed, attended to all the chores of daily life, but also, she writes, they contributed significantly to the fur trade itself, doing a lot of the manual labor that made the fur trade possible. So that's the French side of it, and, for example, in the Ojibwe side, Wingerd writes, they fish, harvest wild rice, plant corn, squash, and pumpkins, and manage the sugar-making process, all of which had value as items of trade as well as food for their families, and as well as producing shirts, moccasins, and robes that were essential for European survival in the backcountry. And right at the end of this paragraph, a really extraordinary sentence, Wingerd writes, and some wives traded directly along with their husbands or took over when spouses either died or became ill or separated from them. So women had a really central role in the fur trade as well. In the social fabric that keeps the fur trade functioning and in the economic and material basis by which the fur trade is actually operated.
Yeah, and I think we might have touched on this in the last episode as well, but oftentimes indigenous women were the chief diplomats for their families, for their businesses, for their tribes, either with other bands or traders, voyageurs, explorers coming from the east. Oftentimes, if the men were either away trading or hunting or other business, it was the women who were doing all of those other tasks, like you said, who would be there to welcome, entertain, and keep their guests abreast of what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now that we have a good sense of the different sort of cultures, or we've been reintroduced to the different cultures that are hanging out in Minnesota at this time, let's talk about what's going on the imperial side of things and get into our discussion of the sort of changes that take place as France slowly slips away from contesting power in this area.
Yeah, so like we said, rather than a site of conquest, this was a place that came together through those complicated kinship relationships that was mixed in with trade and all of that. Let's jump to the year 1696. A good year. Thank you. So I'm on page 26. I'm quoting Wingerd. In 1696, to control the flow of pelts into the saturated European market, France had ordered traders to withdraw from the West, just as the Dakotas finally had established direct trading ties. But only 2 years later, war with England was impending, and the French crown reversed its policy. Despite the stagnant market in furs, an expansionist plan was put into place to win the loyalty of the Western tribes and hem in the English colonies. However, with the outbreak of Queen Anne's War in 1702, Western policy changed yet again, and the French pulled back from the West to concentrate their efforts on protecting their eastern interests. To the frustration of the Dakotas, direct trade with the French would stagnate for another decade, end quote. So a lot of instability as we enter the 1700s for the Dakota people, and a lot of trust is breaking down. Remember, if these are these kinship relationships, at least when it comes to the official and legal French traders, that trust, that bond is very, very weak, increasingly weak. Things that you would normally do on faith, you're going to bargain a little more than you would if it's your brother-in-law or your cousin or your uncle.
That's right. And all of this is affected by the imperial European political maneuverings of the time period. Wars that are fought in Europe between England and France have ramifications for the world of Minnesota. For example, when France finds itself in a financial pickle as a result of these wars, they have to pull back from trading. And when you have to pull back from trading, you have to cut off some trade negotiations, some deals, and that led to a sense of abandonment among the Dakota.
That's right. But when there's this vacuum of trade, someone else tends to step in. And in this case, who stepped in were the Ojibways. So, like we said, the Dakota were just about to deal directly with France and French traders. But when they had to pull out, then the Ojibways were able to step back into the role of the middleman when it came to trade. So the Ojibways generally had more stability in this overall unstable environment. But it did lead to some diplomacy and better trade relationship between the Dakota and the Ojibwe overall. Though, of course, that does not last as we get into some skirmishes later in the 1730s.
Let's read this section on page 28 that gets into what we're talking about.
Me?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Quote, unfortunately for the French, their previous abandonment of the West had injured their credibility as trading partners. The Ojibways, who had a long history as French trading partners, had not been entirely deserted during the war. Moreover, the Ojibways had not yet become dependent on European products for their survival and well-being. Thus, while fewer goods and weaponry made their way to the Western Lakes, the scarcity had been inconvenient but not disastrous. In fact, the disappearance of French traders had yielded some benefit. Though trade had diminished, by sharing the scarce commodities with their Dakota neighbors, they had strengthened their position as middlemen. All of these considerations helped assuage Ojibwe resentments against the French. The Dakotas, however, were less easily wooed. Too many times Frenchmen had come with gifts and pledges of friendship and then failed to return, leaving their Dakota, quote, brothers without the weapons to challenge their better armed enemies. As the French would discover, the Dakotas had turned to other available sources for goods, Ojibwe middlemen and the unlicensed coureurs de bois. When licensed French traders returned, they found that the Dakotas were willing to barter, but with increasing access to other commercial partners, the Indians intended to set the terms. Further destabilizing the French monopoly, the Dakotas had made peace with the Fox tribe of the Wisconsin River area, who then established thriving trade. So, not great for France politically. Obviously, there are still French people in the coureurs de bois who are finding success, but again, those are based on the kinship relationships. Mostly, in a broad generalization, the international politics isn't the top concern. It is those, for the indigenous groups here, it is mostly those individual relationships that you're building that directly impact their lives.
Yeah, I want to bring up one ramification of what you just read. So the peace between the Dakotas and the Fox tribe leads to the French deciding to bring a trade conflict into a military conflict, and they set out on a series of wars against the Fox tribe, which starts in the early 1700s and ends in the 1730s. And the reason why I want to bring that up is to emphasize how much this imperial fur trade, changing priorities and conflicts, turns the Minnesota area and the upper Midwest in general into what Wingerd at one point refers to as a war zone of sorts. The chaos and the instability, the lack of stability that Sam talked about, it directly leads to widespread violence, essentially. She has a whole section titled Warzone, describing, and that the first sentence of that section on page 30 is written, the priorities of empire had turned colonial politics into a chronic financial drain as well as a diplomatic nightmare, so it is not surprising that by the 1730s France began to take a renewed interest in finding a route to the Western Sea. And these shifting priorities of empire lead to, like Sam mentioned, those diplomatic breakdowns, which leads to violence.
Yes. And it is important. There's this European style of warfare that is essentially, it's Risk. It's not the board game Risk. It's troops meeting troops, taking over territory, and our understanding of Ojibwe and Dakota, and the upper Midwest indigenous style of warfare is much. It's more skirmishes. It's less. We have declared war now. We are at war now. Okay, now we're at peace. It is much more these individual smaller conflicts that lead to perhaps uneasy peace, but general peacefulness. So there is a distinction when we talk about violence, and we're going to see sort of a combination and a manipulation of both of those styles of warfare, essentially. I do have one thing. I know small anecdotes like this always help me to remember things, but again, a small example of sort of that those smaller acts of war that maybe didn't register with the Europeans the way that they registered with other indigenous groups. And this is right before that Warzone quote that Logan did before. Quote, in 1735, a Dakota war party killed 2 Frenchmen who had been trading with an enemy tribe, then appeared at a post on Lake Pepin, brandishing the traders' scalps as a warning. After several such intimidating incidents, the post commandant asked Dakota Chief Sacred Born why they insulted their French brothers. The chief replied succinctly that the act was done, quote, with reflection and design, end quote. And I just think that is a great little anecdote. And
well done.
Can I say badass here? I think we're our own censors.
We're our bosses. That's right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'd say it's a badass quote. So if there are any 6th graders listening for their local history unit, I apologize.
Let's talk about the war between the Dakota and the Ojibwe.
Yeah.
It centers around, or Wingerd's telling of the lead up to the war, which starts in 1836, centers around this man named Pierre Gaultier de Varenne Sieur de la Verendre. We'll just call him La Verendre.
I didn't know you were studying French at Yale, Logan.
This La Verendre, this character, steps in as a central figure in the French fur trade. He has at some point what Wingerd describes as a close sympathetic relationship with the northern tribes especially, she writes. However, he makes a lot of mistakes in trying to navigate this complicated world between the Dakota and the Ojibwe and the various other tribes here and there. He understands that you have to have these proofs of your kinship relations and your social obligations to various people. So, Wingerd writes, quote, as proof of his friendship, La Verendre liberally dispensed bullets, guns, butcher's knives, daggers, gunflints, awls, tobacco, and etc. Which essentially means that he's handing out a ton of guns and weapons in a war zone with no regard for who he's giving them to, nor with any consideration of the fact that, for example, giving many, many guns to the Dakota might be seen by the Dakota as a promise of support in war or conflict, and at the very least, a implicit support at the very least. So what happens is, if essentially these small conflicts between the Dakota and the Ojibwe accidentally catch Verendre's son. Verendre's son is killed in an attack by the Dakotas, motivated by this long-standing sense of betrayal that the Dakotas have towards the French that we talked about earlier.
They've got his son. So his son is on the Dakota the Cree's side, right?
Yeah, his son. Well, his son was not on the Dakota side. On the Cree side, and the Dakota War Party hunts him down and kills him, and decapitates him, and decapitates him, wraps his head in beaver skins, and positions him and several other people in a council circle, as Wingerd writes, which she points out signifies that the French had brought the attack on themselves. This was an attack with a political point, which was that the betrayal and the double dealing by the French, the Dakota were not interested in entertaining anymore.
Can I just say, Logan, sacre bleu.
Sacre bleu. Well said. We're both Frenchmen, apparently.
Yeah, but again, that's an example of we have kind of this Western idea of what is kind of an honorable or respectable kind of warfare.
Sure, yeah.
And the Dakota, Ojibwe, Cree, Assiniboine sort of that the Great Plains style of indigenous warfare is not what we would identify as that, the honorable, upright people in uniforms doing their training, and when we wave the white flag, where we stop and we do this
That's
and
right.
this and follow all these rules. It is more just honest brutality, and these smaller acts rather than trying to destroy a village or a settlement or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that distinction there, but obviously La Verendre is not in a great place with all of this.
No, with the death of his son, he sponsors a full-out war, supplying the Crees, Assiniboines, and Ojibways to go take down the Dakotas. And so this large-scale war between the Dakota and their northern neighbors has enormous ramifications.
Mm-hmm.
As she writes, it ends nearly 100 years of peaceful relations between the Ojibwe, Crees, Assiniboines, and Dakota.
Yeah, so things are going, things are flying in every direction. And
Yes.
what part of the motivation is obviously for the Ojibwe, I'm on page 33 here, I quote, the Ojibways desperately needed to expand their territory. Their population had grown significantly. Sam, butting in again, they had more stability than some of the other indigenous people in the area, so their population is doing better. Okay, back to Wingerd. Both from natural increase and immigration of clans fleeing conflicts in the east. Game was disappearing fast, and they needed to claim new hunting grounds or starve. Moreover, the Ojibways had long been a commercial nation. Trading ties with the French had become an established part of their livelihood. They could not afford to alienate their commercial partners by allying themselves with the hostile Dakotas. Thus, the Indian War would be fought sporadically across Minnesota for the following century. One of the longest wars in American history was intrinsically tied to European imperial politics and an international market economy. End quote.
Yes, that's a great point. So.
Well, thank you. I made it myself.
A great a great selection from the book.
I am a
Wingerd gives a history of the war over from 1736 over the next few years, the first outbreak of the war. One of the significant events of those early years is a smallpox epidemic that devastates the Ojibwe in 1736, or more accurately, especially devastates the Ojibwe's allies, the Crees and the Assiniboines.
Mm-hmm.
As Wingerd writes, the death toll was catastrophic, wiping out entire bands. That's significant.
Yeah. So, like we said, there are these skirmishes that obviously span over the course of a century, and much more. Most of the war is in trade and cutting off trade routes, and then obviously you take in the disease. Most of the warring is navigating the external factors and trying to use them to the advantage there.
The kind of descent of, I'm on page 37 now,
Mm-hmm.
the descent of this area into bloodshed and conflict as a result of the chaos brought on by the changing imperial policies of the fur trade means that it's less of a profitable area for France. And they are growing less and less interested in attempting to officially continue the fur trade in the area.
Well, clearly they had extra beaver fur to go around. They were wrapping it in with decapitated heads. It's,
right. There you go. So there's a number of councils and discussions between the French and the Dakotas and the Ojibwe. Things come to a standstill of sorts
mm-hmm.
Between the Dakota and Ojibwe, with these simmering new tensions bursting every now and then. More importantly, the French start to back away.
Mm-hmm.
By the time of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, France is ready to give up.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1763, in the Treaty of Paris, Wingerd writes, the French ceded their North American possessions with the exception of New Orleans to England. New France was dead. And according to the newly redrawn European map of North America, Indian country east of the Mississippi now belonged to the British Crown.
Not that they really know much about where the Mississippi is.
Right, yeah.
So the folks in Paris and London, or even New York, really have no clue what they're fighting over to a large extent, because at least from a macro perspective, they don't know the full value and context of most of North America. And so from their overall perspective in history, the wars that are shaping and impacting generations and cultures that have been on Earth for thousands of years is just a byproduct. It is it is a secondary theater of war to most of their imperial pursuits, and that's part of why North Country is so dense. It's not like we have these stories ingrained in us because it's just part of the narrative that we all know and that it has been told and told and told. We are just now, relatively recently, trying to reorient our history to include the stories that matter to more people, and tell stories that aren't just from the macro imperial perspectives of people of countries like France and England. And so this is the French and Indian War is generally the byproduct. I know, when I was in American history class, the French and Indian War was only mentioned to talk about the lead up to the Boston Tea Party, and not, a war that was fought pretty much where we live by people who lived here, which, hot take, might be a little more relevant or interesting to the kids living and learning in Minnesota. But that is neither here nor there. Okay, rant over.
I want to bring us to a segue into our next episode by reading Wingerd's a very effective concluding paragraph on page 39. Wingerd writes, quote, the map of Minnesota is dotted with places that still bear French names. Mille Lacs, Lac qui Parle, Traverse des Sioux, Grand Marais, and dozens more. The only physical reminder of more than 100 years of the French and Indian encounter. French explorers and entrepreneurs pioneered trading routes and fueled the European imagination about the riches of North America's interior, but they planted no permanent settlements in Minnesota. Their trading posts crumbled away and were forgotten, until rediscovered by archaeologists many generations later. Nonetheless, the legacy of this era was profound. The interdependence and cultural accommodation it demanded between the French and Indians created a new social space, a hybrid culture that would shape Indian-white relations in the region for the next 100 years. And now that concluding Mary Wingerd. Now back to Logan. That new world that the British have inherited is the world we're going to step into in Chapter 3 of Wingerd's book when we return.